Welcome into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steven. It is time for take 2 because I already recorded this video today, but apparently something went wacky. I recorded a few hours ago actually, and then I did a bunch of other work, and then I came to edit this to upload and put on so that you can see it at about 6 o'clock tonight, and realized that, I don't know, something went really wrong. So hopefully everything goes fine with this recording. It's the week 16 wide receiver rankings that we'll be going through. Week 16, the running back rankings will be out tomorrow morning. And then, of course, we have another Thursday night game. Might be the last one of the season, where I will go live 2 hours prior to kickoff for any start-sit questions. Same with on Saturday. We've got 2 games on Saturday. I'll go live 2 hours prior to kickoff then. And then Sunday morning, I will be, once again, live for you here for any start-sit questions. Well, hopefully you didn't spoil yourselves. If you did, that's on you. But there we go. Now I've got the surprise set up. Before we get into everything, of course, please do drop a like. That is always appreciated. And other than that, you will see my projections throughout the video. Of course, the order that I go through will be my rankings. And for the projections for the player, the gauge next to the player's name, the matchup gauge, all of those. Red is good, blue is bad, white is neutral. And before we get into the rankings, we will recap how I did in Week 15 for my DFS plays, as well as my loves and my fades. Second recordings are never as good as the first, so we'll see how I do on this recording. But for the DFS plays last week, at the bottom of the barrel, big tournament long shot, I gave you Parker Washington at $3,400. I thought that the return of Jamal Agnew may have gotten me off of Parker Washington here. He did have 6 targets in the game, so that wasn't too bad, but he didn't do anything with those targets, so that was bad. And I said that I would take a shot on Tyler Lockett at $4,900. That shot would not have paid off. That was a no bueno go. And same with Stephon Diggs at $8,400. I thought that he might be a solid contrarian play, and they just didn't need him too much. But when we get to the loves, doing a little bit better here, I gave you Jaden Reed, Zay Flowers, Rashee Rice. Jaden Reed finished with 14 fantasy points and half PPR scoring, 18th on the week for all of wide receivers. And Rashee Rice finished with 19.6 fantasy points, finished 10th on the week in half PPR scoring. So good job there. Zay Flowers, unfortunately, only finished with 1.2 fantasy points, so that did not go so well for him. Then for my fades, I had Keenan Allen, Jalen Waddle, and Drake London. Keenan Allen, of course, did not play in last week, so that doesn't matter. But Jalen Waddle finished 2nd on the week. He was a fade, may I remind you. Yeah, he had 24.2 fantasy points. It was a really good week for him. At the time, of course, I didn't know that Tyreek Hill would be out, but at the same time, it's not like I moved Jalen Waddle up with that news because of the weather and the opponent and stuff. So big fail there on Jalen Waddle. But on the other hand, with Drake London, big success there. He finished 75th on the week with 3.4 fantasy points. Now, let's get into the Week 16 rankings. And here's my first tier of wide receivers, starting off with CeeDee Lamb at wide receiver 1, followed by A.J. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tyreek Hill, Mike Evans, Justin Jefferson. If you got him, you're playing him. And that does include Justin Jefferson for me. I think it was promising. He had 10 targets last week. Solid matchup here against Detroit. Let's move on to the second tier of wide receivers, which I believe is a little bit bigger of a tier. And I do believe I dropped somebody out of this tier, at last video when I realized something. So we'll get to that. But first of all, to start off this tier, it kicks off with Stephon Diggs. Really good matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers. If it wasn't for recent outcomes, he'd be in the other tier. But I do think that there's a chance that we could see another week where it's all about Cook and how well he does on the ground and everything, because I don't know about this Los Angeles Chargers offense really putting up too much of a fight against Buffalo this week. Then at wide receiver 8, we've got Deebo Samuel. He's been on a roll. He is now the EV equalized value wide receiver number 5 equalized value, much like average fantasy points per week. Per week. However, it takes consistency into account there. So he has obviously been very, very good this season. Darn near a must start. And then DJ Moore, I've got at wide receiver 9. He is one of my loves of the week going up against Arizona, and because of the matchup, the floor is fantastic, and because of who he is, the talent, what he's done this season, the ceiling is also quite high, so I just really don't see benching him this week. I think that would be a mistake. Then we've got Cooper Kupp at wide receiver 10, followed by Brandon Ayuk, Puka Nacua, DK Metcalf at wide receiver 13, followed by Rashee Rice at wide receiver 14, and 10, 9, 10, 9. What do those numbers mean? I didn't just repeat 2 numbers in a row. That's been the last 4 weeks of targets for Rashee Rice, averaging 9.5 targets per week ever since his kind of breakout here. So that's put him into really good territory in this offense, going up against Las Vegas. Nothing to be too afraid of there. And looking for that to continue going. He's been very good for you. Then we've got Jalen Waddle at wide receiver 15, Devontae Adams at wide receiver 16. A fade for me this week going up against Kansas City, which means he'll probably be seeing a lot of L'Jarius Sneed, who has shut down some very, very good wide receivers on the season. Last time that these two teams met, Adams finished with 5 receptions for 73 yards. So just expecting, like the most likely scenario to be something similar to that. So not a whole lot of upside, but still probably not sitting him unless you really can. Then we've got Devonta Smith at wide receiver 17 to finish this tier up. And I did have Calvin Ridley in this tier, but I moved him down to the next tier. So let's just really quick, while I'm still on that note for Calvin Ridley, he's going up against Tampa Bay. It's a top 5 wide receiver matchup, so that is fantastic. In the past 2 weeks without Christian Kirk, he's had 13 targets and 12 targets. That's been fantastic. He hasn't done a whole lot with those targets, unfortunately. And in addition to that, since Christian Kirk's been out, he had 150-plus air yards 2 weeks ago, and then last week he had a 150-plus yard game. Or is that somebody else? He's had 150-plus air yards per game. That's right. Last week he didn't do great either. But that's more than any of his first 11 games. He is a boomer bust option. Unfortunately, most likely going to be having C.J. Beathard at quarterback for him, and that's not very promising. And that is something that I had forgotten originally when I ranked him, so I pushed him down to right ahead of Garrett Wilson there at wide receiver 23. So this tier for me goes from wide receiver 18 to 25, and it kicks off with Chris Olave, a love of mine, whatever. Carr is coming off of his best game all season long. Olave is already considered to be playing and in this weekend, so I think we can think that he is as healthy as one can be at this point in the season. He's been the EV wide receiver 11 on the season. So I think when all is on the line here, I think you can trust Chris Olave pretty well this week. Then we've got Amari Cooper in at wide receiver 19. And with Joe Flacco, he's averaged 9 points, targets per game, averaged 13.3 points in half PPR scoring formats for you, so that's pretty hard to sit. Then we've got T. Higgins at wide receiver 20 without Jamar Chase playing, and with Jake Browning giving T. Higgins his trust, trusting his wide receivers, giving T. Higgins opportunities to make plays on balls. That's how you get plays like you got last week, and so I hope, for any T. Higgins owners that can continue going forward, and I just like what I saw there in general from the quarterback to the wide receiver there. Then we've got Jordan Addison at wide receiver 21, and I speculated last week that Nick Mullins would be good for Addison, and he was. I think that the production to the level that we got last week for him was a bit lucky, but it's a plus wide receiver matchup this week against Detroit, so I'm willing to put him back out there and hope for the best. Again, then we've got DeAndre Hopkins in at wide receiver 22 there, going up against Seattle, another plus wide receiver matchup, and believe it or not, his average targets per game is basically identical, whether it's been Levis or Tannehill in at quarterback for him, so not too much changes there as far as expectations and, potential. Then we've got Calvin Ridley in at wide receiver 23. I already talked about that. There are some concerns. Same with Garrett Wilson. There are some concerns. Wide receiver 24. And last time we saw Brett Rypien in at quarterback, outside of whatever throws he had at the end of last week's game, he targeted Wilson 2 times on 13 pass attempts in that game. That comes to about 5 to 6 targets, less than 6, but pretty much 6 targets on average based on how many pass attempts that the New York Jets have on average per game. So that's not a whole lot to work with, especially for Garrett Wilson. The thing is, and why, I'd definitely be concerned about this fade, and why I'm not low, don't have him lower in my rankings, is because he is going up against the Washington Commanders defense. That is a excellent matchup, but I don't think it's a slam dunk this week if Brett Rypien is in at quarterback for him. Then we've got Courtland Sutton in at wide receiver 25. And, you know, if he got you this far, then I don't see any reason to necessarily stop playing him if you are in a position where he is your wide receiver 2 or flex option. Just go for it and hope for the best. Then we've got a new tier of wide receivers going from, wide receivers 26 through 33, which kicks off with Chris Godwin. He has had 11 and 12 targets in the past 2 games. He has been unlocked seemingly in this offense in those past 2 games recently. He had 142 air yards 2 games ago, and he had 155 receiving yards this past week. Both of those numbers much higher than his average on the season. He's in a plus wide receiver matchup. I would prefer that CJ Beathard was not playing on the other side of the ball. I'd like it to be Trevor Lawrence to make this more of a shootout type of situation to guarantee that Tampa Bay is going to have to pass the ball more. Unfortunately, that's not quite the scenario, but I do still trust, trust as much as possible here Chris Godwin and that recent upside that he's had. It's been, great, and I'm willing to go for it here. Then we've got Jayden Reed at wide receiver 27. I usually downgrade receivers that are going up against Carolina. However, Jayden Reed does have this Deebo Samuel-esqueness to his game. He's very good in open spaces. He's much like a running back in some ways. And Carolina sucks against the run. So, and on top of that, Green Bay doesn't necessarily have much of a running game, a great running game. So I do expect them to utilize Jayden Reed in the ways that they've utilized him throughout the season. Put him out on jet sweeps, get him some screens here and there, get him just short passes in the open field, and with some yak opportunities. That's what I expect for Jayden Reed, and that's where I expect him to find some success against Carolina, of course. As I said, the receivers against Carolina hasn't been a great matchup for them just because a lot of teams don't have to pass a lot against Carolina. So the floor is a little bit scary for Jayden Reed, and that is the only reason he's not getting the love from me is because of how low that possible floor is. If they don't decide to use Jayden Reed like that, or if A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones can just run through this Carolina porous defense anyways. Then we've got Tyler Lockett in at wide receiver 28, and there's nothing to say except that it's a good matchup, and hopefully Geno is back in at quarterback. Then we've got Jacoby Myers at wide receiver 29. He had 17.1 fantasy points in half PPR scoring in his previous matchup against Kansas City, so we're going to give a little bit of faith to that possibly happening again. Then we've got Nico Collins in at wide receiver 30, and between Case Keenum and the Cleveland DST, I am nervous. Well, defense, I'm just nervous about Nico Collins this week. I would love to have him much higher, but I just really can't between those 2 factors. And I might actually lower him more than where I currently have him behind some of these other guys. But we did see that Keenum was able to get the ball to Noah Brown last week, so there is some hope here for Nico. Then we've got Zay Flowers in at wide receiver 31, and I expect Baltimore to give San Francisco one hell of a game this weekend, and I would expect Flowers to be part of that, especially because his play style, more of a low ADOT, high receiving targets type of player, and I say high targets in this offense, it is for a 23% target share or something like that. That fits well in this matchup. San Francisco allows the second most receptions per game, and they allow the second lowest yards per completion. So that's a match made in heaven for Zay Flowers compared to some of the deep target receivers. And we've got Drake London here at wide receiver 32, and he is who he is. So you put him in there and you hope for the best. But for him and Zay Flowers, of course, not excellent matchups there against San Fran and Indianapolis. And Deontay Johnson wraps his tier up at wide receiver 33. And it's tough to think that Mason Rudolph is going to be any better or worse at quarterback for these receivers for this offense than Trubisky and Pickett have been throughout the entirety of the season. So I'm expecting more of what we've seen throughout the entirety of the season ultimately, and this is roughly what Deontay Johnson has been throughout the season, a flex option. So that's going to bring us on to our final tier here, tier 5, which kicks off with Adam Thielen, the only one I'm really going to talk about in this group, but this tier goes from wide receiver 34 through 39, and it includes Adam Thielen, followed by Terry McLaurin, Josh Downs, Josh Palmer, George Pickens, and Noah Brown. For Adam Thielen going up against Green Bay, this season, Green Bay has been a minus matchup for wide receivers, a bad wide receiver matchup, somewhere in between minus to bad. And unfortunately, for me as a Packers fan, they absolutely fell apart last week, and I could see Carolina taking advantage of that, using that Chris Godwin game plan a little bit, and getting Adam Thielen the ball into the middle of the field. I think Adam Thielen works well in the middle of the field, and that's exactly where Green Bay was so susceptible last week. So I am willing to take a shot on that compared to some of these guys in some rougher matchups here, other question marks. Yet again, obviously I don't love it, but I really don't love any of it once we get to this point in the wide receiver rankings. And here are several guys who I'm currently not ranking. Since recording earlier today, Jamar Chase has been ruled out, so he is actually out. But Zay Jones, Christian Watson, Juju Smith-Schuster, Keenan Allen, Marquise Brown, Michael Pittman Jr., Michael Thomas, all not ranked. So, of course, that could change some of the rankings of others. For instance, Josh Downs, that's part of the reason why I have him up there. Expect him to get a few more targets this week than normal, assuming Michael Pittman is going to be out. That's going to bring us on to the DFS buys of the week. At the bottom of the barrel, big tournament long shot, I've got you Wan'Dale Robinson at $3,900 going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. It seems like a good setup for Wan'Dale Robinson, and much like what my argument was for Zay Flowers against San Francisco, we have a similar thing working in favor of Wan'Dale Robinson in this matchup. A lot of targets, low ADOT, should work well against Philadelphia. And I'm also going to be taking a shot on a couple of guys here. Obviously, I'm going to be willing to take a shot on DJ Moore, ranked 9th overall in my rankings. He's only going to cost you $6,900 at wide receiver this week. I love the ceiling for that cost. And then Calvin Ridley at $6,300 seems worth taking a shot as well. Well, that was before I lowered him down in my rankings. I don't know that I'm so excited about that either at 6,300, maybe more of a contrarian play. So you know what? That's what we're going to say. Let's call that a contrarian play. Calvin Ridley at $6,300 is going to be the contrarian play because I didn't really have a good one. There you go. That is it for my Week 16 wide receiver rankings. Thank you very, very much. And now I got to edit this, get this on, load it on up for you, and get it out. Peace out.